All right, so welcome back to part 2 of our discussion of heresy trials. Now, you opened last episode, you gave me the nickname of Zap Brannigan. You want to explain that a little further?
I was just thinking how much of a ladies' man you are, and
Oh, yeah.
has nothing to do with your ego.
Yeah.
No, I just thought you would find that funny. I mean, I'm trying to remember, who's the other? I mean, I'm not going to call you Fry. Anyway, that would be a little.
I always viewed myself as more of a bender, but
Bender, yeah, I thought about that one too. So, yeah, Bender, he's he's an interesting character. But yeah, there's the jokes on there. I wonder how many people actually get all of the references, because, like, I noticed even in like one of the first episodes, Bender, his beer is called Old Fortran.
yeah.
I actually had to learn Fortran as a programming language when I was a computer science minor in college, but I don't know if it's even still used in engineering or anything like that. There was just old, like in the ballistics, there were old programs that were written in Fortran, so you still had to know it. But anyway. It's been an enjoyable show to watch. So
I'm glad you're enjoying it. So we left off last episode talking about heresy trials, and we got to the issue of leadership and the stakes that leadership have in maintaining an orthodox position, even on fringe topics such as LGBTQ affirmation or like women in leadership. And those tend to be the issues that we see today as splitting the church. The Southern Baptist Convention just kicked out a church for having a female pastor.
yes,
Even though they voted then to not make that a test for membership in the Southern Baptist Convention. So they're contradicting themselves while also excluding whole congregations. The leadership is up to something. What's going on?
Yeah. I'm not going to pretend to know what's in their minds. That is an interesting case. I find some of this interesting because there is a certain duplicity in the way some of these things are handled. For example, I know of a denomination that affirms women in ministry, but yet has recently stripped credentials from several ministers for being LGBTQ affirming, and suggesting that the denomination ought to consider becoming affirming. And they were put on trial for heresy for spreading unchristian doctrine. And this really came about as a culmination of the fact that they tried to make a case of this earlier and then had to redefine what central doctrine is in their governing manuscripts that guide the denomination. And basically said that every issue is central doctrine. Like, I don't know how you even defend that.
It's the calcification of a very particular worldview.
It's like saying that what's in the book of Jude is just as authoritative as the Gospel of John or something.
Right. Mm-hmm.
It makes no sense whatsoever.
It would be like saying, well, the writings of Augustine are perfect and inspired by God.
Well, and here's the thing. The reason, the duplicity I find in this is because, like I said, at least the Southern Baptists, if they thump their Bibles, they try to thump it pretty consistently. But here's a denomination that, used a broader hermeneutic for saying, we don't have a problem with women being pastors and being in positions of authority. But yet when it came to the issue of sexuality, oh no, you can't use that same hermeneutic here. It doesn't apply. That just is mind-boggling to me. The only thing
when I read about this particular issue, my first thought, this is a Wesleyan denomination where this happened. My first thought was, well, that's not very Wesleyan of them.
No, but and I mean, it was inevitable. Okay, because of this variation in the hermeneutic. So since you mentioned Wesleyan, I mean, that's why the Methodists split over this. Because basically you have, I mean, it's not quite as simple as this, but let me say this. I think that the main body of Methodism is much more prone to follow the quadrilateral than is what is it called? Not the National Methodist Church or what is the name of the dissenting, the splinter group that broke up way?
Oh, I don't know. I didn't know that they had picked a name.
Oh, well, yeah, they have, but I'm trying to remember what it is. I'm thinking Primitive Methodist Church, but that's just my opinion. I don't. I can't. Global Methodist Church, I think, is the term. And that's probably more apt.
Right. Yeah, you're right. It's Global Methodist.
Yeah, and that's probably more apt because that's another thing that's happened. Christianity has spread into South America and Africa, places where people are much more traditionally minded. And so people in Africa and South America are less likely to be tolerant as Americans are starting to become on some of these issues. So, and I don't want to make a mountain out of a molehill there, but that's another dynamic that's affecting this, because actually these global ties now are emboldening the minority voice in the United States to be even stronger and speak up and draw hard lines in the sand.
Right.
So anyway.
It's funny because it's a little issue dependent, because I know like the global church tends to be, at least in the denomination we're talking about, one of the issues that has arisen is the consumption of alcohol.
Yes.
Because globally that's more normalized.
Right.
That didn't raise a big stink.
And that's another thing. So that one would, I mean, I think there's a much stronger, in a lot of American groups, I think, the total absence of alcohol, I think that view is slowly dying. I mean, there are always going to be people that are against any consumption of alcohol, but that one has a much more stronger consensus. And some of these groups that still maintain the rules are only maintaining them for, let's put it this way, they're maintaining them for a small minority of people, but that small minority is still large enough that they can't afford to lose them.
Right.
So that's what I think is going on there. So, and that's interesting as well. At one point, somebody probably, well, again, that would have been deemed though immoral conduct, because you're not, I'm not sure if somebody said, well, I'm not opposed to the consumption of alcohol in moderation, but I myself don't drink. Would that have been, has the person been brought up on heresy charges for that?
Well, and perhaps we should set the stage for what happened in this particular instance that we're addressing.
Yes.
And we're intentionally being vague about who's involved, because we're not directly connected, and we don't want to move that conversation to a place where it's not appropriate.
Yeah, we don't want to make this personal or about individuals or individual organizations. We still want to keep this at a conceptual level.
But what happened is a particular denomination, a Wesleyan denomination, their governing body decided that the doctrines and the covenants in their governing manual were equivalent in importance. So,
well, they had to do that. Let me back up a little step before, because I think that one of the ministers who ended up losing credentials was actually brought up on charges earlier, but then appealed in civil court saying that there wasn't any legal basis for the denomination doing that because the LGBTQ issue was in a section that was not a part of the
core
doctrines.
Right.
And so the court ruled in the minister's favor. So then the denominational hierarchy then ruled that all of these sections are to be considered essential doctrine. So basically saying that if you're a member, especially if you're a minister, there's no room for dissent on even these secondary issues anymore.
Yeah, and historically, as part of this denomination, the covenant section has been constantly evolving, right? So it used to be that the covenant said you can't go to movies and you can't dance. That was changed pretty dramatically to we don't care about either of those things at all. Because they weren't considered core doctrines, they were flexible.
Yeah.
Now that has changed, particularly because of this fringe issue that's not in historical Christianity, not considered important to the Orthodox, like core of, Jesus is the Son of God, died on a cross and rose from the dead 3 days later. This is a tangential issue to the central tenets of the faith. Well, now all of it is a central tenet of the faith. There's no room for disagreement because the covenants are considered just as important as affirming, Jesus, existed and was the Son of God.
So the question in my mind is, okay, at what point is an organization justified in saying, okay, you're out of bounds, you are harming the organization, or you're undermining the organization? So why would any dissent at all be considered harmful?
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky to talk about this without being like specific about this denomination. Because in my opinion, what would have protected from these issues, these particular multiple heresy trials, is having a central vision that would sort of recenter the purpose of the denomination. But that's been a conversation in this denomination for a long time about the becoming generic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's and that's what's interesting. It's like one of the central doctrines is hardly even taught or even discussed anymore, and yet nobody makes any issue over that anymore. It's human sexuality which is going to divide us. And
yeah, well, and it's you have to decide, like, is human sexuality a central part of the mission if we're going to be kicking people out of the denomination over it?
I think that deep down, everybody knows that it's not really central. But why then enforce a boundary? Because I think there's a couple reasons here. It all has to do with public opinion. Because public opinion has gradually become tolerant and open to same-sex relationships and same-sex marriages. But in opposition to that, there is a hardcore element of American society that is strongly and vehemently opposed to same-sex unions and same-sex relationships. And basically, by the groups that struggled with affirming those relationships, the religious groups who struggled with that, a number of them lost people who left and went to other places to worship. And so people that would have been in favor of changing the group 10 to 20 years ago are no longer there. And I think that the vocal minority has now become a majority in this particular case.
Yeah, I think you're probably right.
So, like, let's use the Methodist as an example. The Methodist split, but it wasn't a 50-50 split. It was about 25% of the churches broke away. It's still a lot, okay? But it's 25%. 25% is nowhere near the numbers that they would have to have in order to keep the mother United Methodist Church from changing and becoming affirming. Okay? So the handwriting was on the wall. The denomination was going to become affirming. So the question is, can we leave and go our own way and keep our property? Because that's really what the battle and what the agreement was all about. Because all these religious organizations are set up as corporations, nonprofit corporations. And so the church facilities and things like that, they're all owned by the particular element, like the conference or district or something like that. And so the property's owned there. And so whenever a church leaves a denomination, typically
they leave their property.
They leave their property and have to start all over again. And so the agreement was, okay, we'll leave peacefully if we get to keep our property, such and such, such. And that's kind of the agreement that was made. I think, though, in this other case, I don't think this group ever reached a tipping point of over 50% wanted to become affirming. I think it got very close to 50% at certain points. And in fact, I think that one of the ministers who was defrocked, I think actually ran some polls to try to gauge how much support there was for changing the denomination stance, thinking that the majority was in favor, but there were certain people in the hierarchy that was holding the denomination back. I think that was misguided judgment myself. I think that I feel badly of all this happening, but I think that these pastors or these ministers they made a serious miscalculation. I don't think, and maybe they're aware this is what was going to happen, but I did not see any possibility of the change taking place. There was never a strong majority. It's just like, okay, in Congress and parliamentary law and all this, you know, one party can't get anything done unless they get a 2/3 vote to override filibusters and all these other tactics that the other party uses to delay things. And so you almost have to have 2/3, at least 2/3, to be able to get some kind of controversial change actually enacted. And I don't think this organization ever had that kind of momentum. And the longer it went, I mean, there were people that were trying to build that momentum, but it fell short. And a lot of younger people, they lost a lot of younger people in the meantime, while some of the older ones were still waiting to try to get the tipping point further on the affirming side, but it never reached that tipping point, in my opinion. So let me say this. I don't know in this particular case, like, okay, so if we go back to the Reformation again, just for a second, to make a point of comparison. And like with Wycliffe, there were actually criticisms of the Pope and of the Pope's power and the claim that the church is infallible. God won't let the church make a mistake and all this other kind of stuff. And that was being challenged. So the church hierarchy was being challenged directly and its power. But see, we're now in an era where we're talking about even Protestant groups that are still democratically driven. So a number of these denominations, including the one, like a lot of evangelical denominations, have stipulations where there has to be at least 50% lay representation at every level of church government, even at the very highest levels. So even when you get to like a general governing board of some sort, half will be clergy, half will be lay people. And they did this because some of the mainline traditions, like the Presbyterians and the Methodists and the Lutherans, they were still largely top-down. And so the evangelicals, as they broke away and formed their own groups, they did not want this top-down. They did not want clergy having this kind of control over them. So they changed everything. In fact, they changed it to the point where they had to go back and put protections for clergy in because it was too easy for congregations to just want to change pastors and vote the pastor out and go hire another one. And so there were certain protections, like they put in these clauses saying that a minister may only be removed from office or have credentials removed for either like gross immorality or propagating unchristian teaching or something like that. And that's kind of what kicked in here. And that's what was invoked. But in order to make that case, they basically had to make every issue like a central doctrinal issue to basically elevate what probably should have been a lesser disagreement and make it a major disagreement. Classify it as a major disagreement. I don't think this is as much about the people in power wanting to stay in power in this particular case, as much as it is the people in power having to listen to people that had very strong influence, either through their hierarchical positions or through monetary influence.
Right. Yeah, I think you're definitely right that there's you mentioned earlier that you don't think that it was ever a serious threat to the unity of the denomination because it never had the majority momentum it needed to become a major issue. But I would take the elevation of this issue to the level of orthodoxy, to the point where people are getting kicked out of the church, as an indication that this is considered a serious threat, at least by someone.
Well, okay. So let me qualify that. What I meant was there was never enough support to change the denomination as a whole. So, one of two things was going to happen. Either the people that wanted the church to change and become affirming were just going to get, they'd either just learn to tolerate it, or they would, second, just leave on their own, or third, they would organize and create a split. And that's what happened with the Methodists. And I think that was probably the real danger in this case, was that there would be maybe even like some districts where most churches would split away, especially some of the bigger churches, because some of these pastors who seemed to be the most leaning towards tolerance were those that pastored some of the bigger churches, and which makes sense. In the sense that the bigger your congregation, the more tolerance there has to be, because you have more difference of opinion amongst the people in your congregation. Right. You give a congregation of 50 people, well, they can be pretty like-minded. But if you have a congregation of 500 or 3,000, well, people are going to disagree on some things. And it's just like the difference between living in rural America and living in urban America. The more neighbors you have, the more you have to become tolerant. And so that, to me, is where the power dynamics come in, because if your larger churches are the ones that are part of the tipping point, well, then that's a little different than, okay, so if that 45% in favor of changing includes like three of the five largest churches, for example, I don't know if it's that or whatever.
Sure, yeah.
I'm just saying that
hypothetically. But there's more weight there.
Exactly. Like, you have to take that more seriously, because that leaves a bigger hole than just like, one church of 3,000 leaves a bigger hole than, say, 20 churches of 150 people.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, I also wonder, like, the Methodists split on this issue. They're another Wesleyan denomination. I wonder if them becoming a viable alternative on this issue for young people sapped the strength from this particular denomination's movement to become affirming, because people would rather I'm just going to go over to the Methodists.
Well, yes, I think so. Just like I would venture to say, probably in preceding years, the Methodists probably lost some people to the Episcopal Church.
Yeah.
Because the Methodists came from the Episcopals, right? And then these other Wesleyan groups came from the Methodists. So people are more likely to trace their lineage back one step up, one branch up the tree.
So returning to our central question then, of the nature of heresy trials.
Right.
Where are we?
Okay.
What's the next step here?
Okay, so what the heresy trial is revealing is that this is more than just somebody has an opinion that we don't like. I mean, there is that, but at least heresy trials don't, like, there's a difference between a heresy trial and an all-out inquisition. Let me say it that way.
Mm-hmm.
An inquisition is where you go sniffing out the people that are dissenters. Because, like, for example, and that is one of the dangers of having heresy trials, because that can become a ripple effect.
Can elevate.
Yeah. So you would have districts deciding that we're going to have some kind of an interview process for all Sunday school teachers in all the churches in this denomination to see where they stand on this issue. And in fact, I happen to know that, and sometimes these kind of litmus tests have been applied, like, to educational institutions and other places. So if you're going to be a part of this organization, here's the litmus test. Where do you stand on this issue? It's like everybody's looking for the shibboleth. Here's one of the heretics because they're on the wrong side of this issue. And what is it? Is it really that the view is that harmful? Or is it that the view is threatening the power balance or the power structure of the organization? See, that's another part of it too. So let's say you have, now this may not be as much of a case with a denomination as it would be, say, like with a college, but like places that, any place that's not really selling a product to the general population. So The market forces are just really the people that are showing up and the people that are donating money. So the more money somebody donates or has to donate, the more of a voice that person tends to get as well.
Yeah.
So that there's all kinds of different power dynamics that come into play here.
It's interesting that like an organization, it doesn't have to be even religious, but
right.
An organization that adopts a democratic government structure,
right,
can have democracy undercut by the biggest contributor monetarily.
But that's how democracy operates everywhere, because everything operates on money.
Right. Yeah. So, Marx anticipated that capitalism goes back into feudalism at some point.
Yeah. The only thing is, I think that basically, I kind of take Marx's point to be that just switching economic systems or even a means of exchange is not going to get rid of the class power struggle between the haves and the have-nots. And this happens in every organization. So at some point, every organization, unless you have a very strong organization with a lot of little donors, it takes a lot of little donors to make up for one big donor.
Right.
Especially
in a cultural context that's so divided along those lines.
Well, because yes, we live in one of the most, what's the word I'm looking for? There's the biggest wealth
inequality.
Yes.
Yeah.
We have probably the most wealth inequality. I think we have the most wealth inequality, maybe not in the world, because there may be a couple little places where just a few people and a couple really rich people live there or whatever, like some island or whatever. But by and large, as far as like major countries, yeah, I think there's probably more wealth gap here than any place else.
Well, even historically, we're hitting records.
Yes. And so that's another element of this. So
can democratic institutions that are, I will say, like, have the religious sense of like there is a central orthodoxy to this, can those even exist in a society as stratified as we are?
Well,
right, because essentially when you're bowing down to your biggest donors because they have an ideological bone to pick, you're no longer a democratic institution. It's just like a farce.
Well, and that is a lot of it right there. I hate to say. So, for example, would people rather, let's say you have a group, like a congregation of 150 people, say, for example, or let's just say 100 people. Okay. Would they rather, let's say you have a very wealthy person join the church, but anytime they give money, there's strings attached to it. Now, how much would people give up their say-so or political power? I've said this for years and years and years, going way back, that basically people exchange political power for purchasing power. And people would rather have nicer things and less control over their own lives. And so people are constantly being bought off by the wealthy. Now, I'm talking more generally now. I have no idea if this applies to the examples we've been talking about. I'm just talking in broad terms here now. So I don't want any confusion here. I don't know what kind of influence or whatever may be behind this denominational case we've been discussing. All I'm saying is that, let's put it this way. I would not be surprised if even the denominational leaders personally were sympathetic with these ministers and their positions, but yet their position requires them to protect the structural integrity of the organization. And these ministers run the risk of upsetting the entire apple cart.
It's almost like somebody should have warned the Christian religion in general that it's really hard to follow your ideals and serve God and also be tied to money at the same time.
Well,
if only somebody had said that at the beginning of the religion.
Yeah. Well, again, there was a famous, I'd have to go back and verify this, but I had read this in a book of quotations. Supposedly, was it Paul of Samsota? No, it wasn't him. One of the saints, maybe it was Polycarp, the one who ended up being executed as a heretic.
Mm-hmm.
One of the popes said, after Constantine and they started building these great chapels and such, cathedrals.
Yeah.
That the Pope made a comment, well, no longer can the church say, silver and gold have I none, because that's what Peter and John said to the beggar at the beautiful gate.
Right.
And then supposedly the saints or the church fathers' response was, yeah, but neither can the church say rise up and walk.
Yikes.
So, yeah, I mean, this happens again and again. And honestly, even if you think about even political movements and such, like even the American Civil War. I mean, it took a lot of instigating tipping points to finally get the war actually going, because people because they knew what was going to happen. I mean, it was a complete upheaval. I think this is why Marx was convinced that the change won't happen incrementally. It's got to happen through some kind of revolution.
You have to hit an inflection point where the desperation is great enough.
Right. If the desperation, like the people care enough about the kind of change that they want that they're willing to make material sacrifice to see it happen.
Right.
And sometimes that's why a lot of change takes generations. It basically, the change is actually not individual people changing. It's the change that happens from generation to generation as people's children tend to be a little less uptight about things as they were. And so, like, even you're talking about groups, say, for example, that 50 years ago and 100 years ago thought that it was sinful to attend go to the theater or the cinema or to dance, with couples dancing and things like that. It wasn't that like all of a sudden people like, I guess this isn't really all that bad after all. It really comes after generations are like less and less averse to it. And so it generally takes generations to replace this stuff. And I think that that's partly what's causing a lot of the societal angst that's going on, because the young people are engaging more conversation because of the internet and social media. And they are more gung-ho about change taking place. And yet at the same time, we have people living well into their 90s. And you've got more people that are wanting to hold on to the old way of thinking, and they're not dying off as quickly. Eventually, this will, I guess, hit a point where we'll hit some kind of a new equilibrium of rate of change, perhaps. I don't know. I hope it's not going to be like this now from now on, because the people that are over 70 are at great odds with everybody that's under 30 years old.
Well, Now, to push back against your point a little bit, the people who have been labeled heretics and booted out of the church, they're not very young.
No, but they're not baby boomers. And I think the baby boomers are the ones that are keeping things drugged backwards at this point. I don't think, like, from what I don't know, I have to do more research on this, but I want to say, I think that in terms of, say, like human sexuality, I think Gen X is pretty evenly divided. And then the younger generations are more affirming. But I think that the baby boomers are overwhelmingly not against, they're not affirming. And I don't know if there's still any of the silent generation left or not. If they are, they're probably too old to care about what's going on in society, I guess. But yeah, it's interesting. I just attended a banquet last week, and I ended up sitting by a professor who retired a year before I started teaching. And I've been teaching at this institution for 20 years, and that professor retired a year before. So this professor is now 91 years old, and
wow.
It was interesting. I had an interesting conversation with him, and yeah. And it's interesting because you see, in some ways, like he was still reading and trying to write and do things like that. And so in some ways, like, his thought is still progressing, but yet he still has commitments or frames things in a way that I probably wouldn't frame them anymore. But it's just kind of interesting to be able to experience the difference there in the generations. But
well, there is something that I think is going on in this, like, generational divide, because previous generational divides were not so ugly.
Yeah.
Or like, people weren't getting excommunicated for disagreements on these sorts of matters.
Well,
there's something that's going on in these heresy trials that are like, it is a bit of a modern, like, satanic panic, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I do think, let's put it this way. There's a lot of homophobia coming from someplace. I think it would be unfair to say that the people that are making the decisions are the ones that are homophobic. I don't even know that if that would even be the case. But somebody somewhere is homophobic, and they're making noise about it. And that's why it's considered an issue. I don't understand on what other basis you would have for elevating an issue like that to saying that this is important enough that you are disfellowshipped. That's my question.
Yeah, for those following along at home, the issue that we've been discussing, this minister not only lost their credentials, but lost their membership at their local church.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, it wasn't just you can't teach anymore. It's you are no longer considered in fellowship with the church.
Which my guess is that, and maybe that's the point, because somebody who disagrees is not going to be repentant, so to speak. The Catholic Church tried that back in the Inquisitions, and, even if you torture somebody into recanting, is it really a genuine change of heart? I mean, it's like they talk about, I don't know, and it's just like waterboarding and things like that, Gitmo and all that kind of stuff.
Quartering people.
Yeah. So, I don't know. I just have never seen an issue that so many people are bothered by so much. And I'm not sure where that really comes from. If it's just that they don't want to see it. Now, we talked about, and I'm not going to drag this out, but see, in the previous episode, we talked about, say, empirical evidence. So there has been a period of, say, 20 to 30 years where people who are opposed to same-sex relationships and marriages were looking for evidence to bolster this view. Like, oh, well, look at how so many homosexuals commit suicide. Well, we find it's not because they're suicidal
inherently
because of
suicidal.
Yeah, they're not suicidal because they're homosexual. They're suicidal because nobody will accept their homosexuality.
Right.
And then other things like, well, they'd be happier, like everybody's really heterosexual, and then we'll just use shock therapy or something to straighten them out. And then you find that that's not the way it is, and that's not what's going on. And so they've been down all those trails trying to find some basis for saying, gee, this is causing harm. Well, now here's the thing. I'm going to say this. I understand people saying, no, we don't want to change our doctrine. And if that's where they left it, maybe I think I would be more sympathetic than I am. But most of these folks, and I'm not talking about necessarily church hierarchy, I'm talking about just people in the pews in general. They're not just worried about whether they're going to have to watch a same-sex wedding ceremony in their church, or if their pastor is going to be forced to perform those. That's not what they're upset about. They don't even want it being legal in society. And I don't see the basis of that. I mean,
see, I'm further than you. I'm not even sympathetic to those who just want to like, well, this is just our doctrine and we don't want it to change. Because to make that the litmus test, the shibboleth of the group, what you are doing is, for those who were invested in the central mission of that church or group, it doesn't have to be a church even, like this could be true of any organization. When you replace your central values with a tangential issue that is only important, like really centrally important to a very small number of individuals, all of those who have invested in that community are now excluded from it. And I think that's just an extreme lack of leadership and vision for the group.
No.
And there are consequences to it.
No,
right? Because it becomes the identity.
I agree with you. I'm talking about in a societal sense, as far as what people legally should be able to do and not do. I guess what I want to say is this. I agree with what you just said. I do. What I'm saying is, I would be a little more sympathetic, because to me, it would be one thing to say, okay, well, if society wants it, then I've used this example before. The Roman Catholic refusal to accept divorce. Okay. So Catholics can't get a divorce from the church. They have to get their marriage annulled. Okay.
Right.
But I mean, there was a time where the Catholic Church fought against societies trying to keep divorce illegal or make it almost impossible to get. But at least Catholics are at the point where if they don't want to recognize it within their church, they're at least not forcing their people to stay in bad marriages just because they don't want to change their theology to line up with the reality of what goes on in a lot of marriages. Okay. And so at least I'm still not a big fan of saying, well, gee, the church won't recognize your divorce. I'm not a fan of that. I think that's bad, but at least it's not as bad as when they were working to even keep it out of society because they were so convinced that they were right about it. Okay. That's the point I'm trying to make. If these people who were trying to keep LGBTQ affirming views out of their churches and denominations if they would just be satisfied to let society, though, run its own course, because there is no empirical basis for denying this privilege to same-sex couples or to all individuals.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Then that would at least show some level of tolerance. When somebody, though, they're not just stopping at the church. They are intolerant to the point of, you can't even do it you can't even have this in society. And yet some of these people in the past, same groups, would point the finger at Catholics about how terrible and closed-minded they are, and they're doing the exact same thing.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like at that point, like, that to me is the point at which there's no point in having this discussion with that group.
Yeah.
That even wants it like annulled in society, like no more open homosexuality, put them back in the closet, make them go to, insane asylums again.
Yeah.
That they're on a different world. Their horizons of reality are different than our own.
Yeah.
And there's no room for that conversation until we find common ground.
Well, the fact that most of America, like, that's the thing. These same people are the ones, well, you don't like it, leave it. America, love it or leave it. If you don't like it, then you could go live somewhere else. Well, now that the tables have turned and public opinion has shifted, I guess we could say the same thing to these folks. Hey, well, if you don't like it, go live in a country where they're still against LGBTQ rights and protections. Go live someplace where people think more traditionally. It's one thing to say, I don't believe in it, and so I don't want it in my group. It's another thing to say, I don't believe in it, and so nobody ought to be able to. Based on what? Based on your religious beliefs? Sorry. That's not how civil law is or should be decided. We don't need any kind of theocracy in this country, and we don't certainly need political issues being decided over battles between religions and religious sects.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like that sort of stuff is like, I agree, obviously, but it's outside of our realm.
It is
control here. Like,
well, it is
not just control, but influence. Like,
well,
the society is going to go one way or the other. And I feel like that's true on both sides. Like, individuals who hold opposing views on this issue wield very little influence on the direction of society.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not faulting any of the players involved in these cases. I mean, they make their own decisions, and I don't know.
The problem is when people who should not have a level of influence over, broader society wield influence in ways that is like evil, essentially. I mean, so there's a town in Michigan, I know somebody who lives there, where all of the local Calvinist pastors decided, we're going to rally our congregation to get the library closed.
Mm-hmm.
Because they have books on the shelves that portray LGBTQ people in them. That's evil. That's just straight vile.
Right. Right. No, I agree. And that's the thing. This maybe be another episode. At some point, I want to talk about Jesus and what was his cultural impact in his own context. Because I see Jesus as being someone for tolerance and for acceptance. And
So you're saying you want to go on a quest for the historical Jesus?
Well, what I'm saying is Jesus was not calling the backsliders back to adhering to the law to the letter. He was in fact pushing in the opposite direction, getting rid of superficial, phony religion that puts a veneer of righteousness over hearts full of hate.
Yeah.
And that's what Jesus was, in my opinion, really pushing and against and battling. There's a reason why the New Testament then is always talking about the main thing about Jesus is what? His love, his love, his love. It's not about Jesus, his justice, his justice, his justice. It's about love. And it is relational.
Yeah, how do you know somebody is a Christian? How do you identify people in the church?
Love.
You will know them by their love.
Exactly.
You don't know them because they have a little fish sticker on their car or wear a cross.
Right.
And you definitely don't know them because they're so just like rigorous in their morals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, because that maybe we tackle that in what is the true essence of Christianity, in the sense of how it informs the individual as a citizen, as a neighbor.
Yeah, as a phenomenon.
Yeah. All right. I think we've run the gamut on this topic anyway. And any closing remarks you want to add before we tie it up?
I hope we don't get burned at the stake for what we've said here.
Well, it reminds me of the three. You ever see the Three Stooges short where they were going to execute them, and he said you could either be burned at the stake or go to the guillotine, have your head chopped off. And Larry says, I'd rather have my head chopped off. And Curly says, not me. I'd rather be burned at the stake. He says, why? He says, because a hot steak is better than a cold chop. Okay. It's been fun. It's been fun. We hope you've enjoyed this. And if the world doesn't end beforehand, we'll be back next week with another fun-packed episode for you. And we hope that all of your cynicism is happy. Have a good day.